Hey guys, tonight we slip into a place that feels impossibly far from your glowing phone screen, yet here you are, wandering down the bustling avenues of Ming-era Beijing. You're not sprinting or dodging traffic, though. This isn't a modern city with honking cars and impatient cyclists. No, you're trudging slowly, shoulder to shoulder with merchants who smell faintly of sesame oil, scholars with long sleeves brushing the dust, and donkeys that really don't care where their droppings land. The first thing that strikes you is scale. The walls, the gates, the rooftops, they stretch so far and so wide that your sense of direction fizzles out. You feel tiny in the shadow of stone watchtowers and vermilion gates, as if the city has been designed to remind you you are not the important one here. A gentle reality check for you: if you actually had to live in this place with its smoky air and questionable water supply, you probably wouldn't last more than a week. Still, as a cozy time traveler tonight, you're safe to gawk and shuffle along. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time down in the comments. I love seeing where and when people are drifting off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The streets aren't just thoroughfares, they're stages. Picture a sedan chair gliding by, curtains drawn. Inside might be an official, or maybe just someone who paid for the ride to avoid the mud. Kids chase each other with sticks, the clack of wooden sandals echoes, and a group of soldiers march past, trying their hardest to look intimidating while secretly hoping no one notices their slightly crooked helmets. The Ming capital is Beijing, a city transformed into the imperial hub after Emperor Yongle decided to uproot everything and move it here in the early 1400s. That decision wasn't just about architecture, it was a statement. Stone by stone, the city became a living announcement of power. Historians still argue whether Yongle moved the capital primarily for strategic defense against Mongols or simply because he loved the idea of a grand new center. Either way, you're now standing inside his imperial dream, inhaling the mingling aromas of fried dough and horse sweat. A mainstream historical fact to ground you: the Ming capital's population likely swelled past 1 million residents, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Imagine every alley humming, every market buzzing, every courtyard packed with people navigating this monumental hub. And here you are, pressing your way through, overhearing snippets of gossip you don't quite understand, since everyone seems to be speaking in clipped Beijing dialect. But let's add a quirky tidbit. Stray dogs in the city sometimes wore little bells, not as pets, but as makeshift burglar alarms. Families would keep them near doorways, and when the dogs stirred, so did the household. You pass one now, a scrappy mutt wagging its tail, jingling faintly like a sleepy tambourine. Somehow it feels more charming than threatening. You glance upward, and the skyline isn't modern glass and steel, but tiled roofs that curve like frozen waves. Watchtowers punctuate the walls. A passing monk clutches a prayer bead necklace longer than your arm. You trail behind him, listening to the faint clack of each bead against the next, a rhythm both calming and oddly hypnotic. Everywhere you look, you see movement towards something grander. The city feels like it's funneling you inward, drawing you closer to that great looming forbidden city. It squats behind high crimson walls, daring you to peek inside. You don't get there yet, though. Tonight is about moving slowly, savoring the textures, like when you pause at a stall selling candied hawthorn skewers, glossy, sticky red fruits lined up neatly on a stick. You can't help but imagining licking the syrup, which immediately makes your teeth ache, but it's probably the perfect treat if you don't mind losing a filling or two. What keeps you drifting forward, besides curiosity, is the rhythm of the watch drums. In the Ming capital, time is literally sounded out for you. Gongs, clappers, and drums mark hours, quarters, and the important transitions of day and night. Right now, you catch the low, resonant beat of a drum tower in the distance, guiding you like a sleepy metronome. A scholarly debate lingers in the air. almost as thick as the wood smoke. Some historians still argue whether Ming Beijing was more cosmopolitan than contemporaneous cities like Istanbul or Delhi, or if its grandeur masked a somewhat rigid inward-looking bureaucracy. For you, the traveler, those debates dissolve into the sheer sensory overload of the present moment. You can feel the grit on your sandals, the tickle of dust in your throat, and the press of humanity all around. And then there are the animals. Horses clip-clop steadily, cows lumber reluctantly, and somewhere in the distance you hear a goose honking with surprising authority. Maybe it's scolding you personally. You can't tell. The Ming capital has room for everyone, even sarcastic poultry. You shuffle further along a market lane, brushing past bolts of silk dyed in shades that make modern paint catalogs look boring. A man with a fan painted with mountains waves it lazily, more for style than temperature control. Another merchant sells little packets of incense, each promising to mask the smells of city life with lotus or sandalwood. You can't help but thinking of them as Ming-era air fresheners, the equivalent of those pine-shaped things dangling from rearview mirrors today. The deeper you go, the more the city feels alive with whispered rules. Don't walk too close to a procession. Don't stare too long at someone above your station. Don't accidentally trip over an official's robe. And yet, amid the caution, there's laughter. Children giggling as they splash through puddles, women bartering with playful jabs, and an old storyteller who raises his voice just loud enough for you to hear the tale of a tiger that once prowled near the outskirts of the city. You catch only fragments, but the exaggerated gestures do half the work. The sun dips lower, brushing the rooftops with gold, and shadows stretch long. The city doesn't slow down. It hums, ever restless, like a hive of bees that somehow managed to invent bureaucracy. And you, an accidental time tourist, keep drifting, hypnotized by the rhythm of footsteps, voices, bells, and drums.
You follow the pull of the crowd until, before you quite realize it, the great red walls of the Forbidden City rise like a horizon in front of you. They're smooth, tall, and just a little intimidating. The sort of walls that remind you that someone very important and very guarded lives behind them. The Meridian Gate towers above, its 5 arches standing like silent bouncers. You slip along with a stream of officials, their embroidered robes whispering authority as they pass. Inside, the pace changes. Outside, the walls was chaos, hawkers, animals, dust. But here, the air feels almost rehearsed. The courtyards stretch so wide that you could lose yourself just crossing them. Stone tiles radiate the day's heat back at your sandals, and you're already regretting not bringing water. Ming architects weren't designing for comfort. They were designing for awe. And you, small and sweaty, are duly awed. Everywhere you turn, bureaucracy breathes. Clerks shuffle thick bundles of bamboo-bound documents, scribes sharpen brushes over tiny porcelain inkwells, and runners dart from one hall to another like ants carrying crumbs. If you thought modern office life was soul-crushing, try doing it in embroidered silk under the gaze of stone-faced officials. There's a reason Ming records are so exhaustive. Someone's cramped hand wrote down nearly everything. A mainstream fact anchors this image. The Ming government had 6 main ministries: personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and works. Each one had to coordinate with the emperor and with each other, a recipe for endless paperwork. You imagine one unfortunate scribe copying the same decree 20 times while sighing audibly enough to earn a side-eye from his supervisor. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some clerks used ink mixed with glue to make their writing shinier and more impressive. It probably looked fancy at first, but when the humidity rose, the glue could warp the paper. So you might spend hours drafting a memorial to the emperor for it to buckle into something resembling a toddler's art project. Not exactly career-enhancing. You notice a row of officials lined up for an audience. Each one holds a tablet of polished wood, like an ancient clipboard, on which petitions or notes are written. Their hats tilt slightly forward, flat as serving trays. A breeze stirs, and you picture those hats catching wind like kites, though no one dares laugh at the sight, at least not openly. Historians still argue whether the Ming bureaucracy functioned as a smoothly oiled machine or as an elaborate theater of formality. On one hand, the state managed taxes, armies, and grand construction projects. On the other, layers upon layers of reports meant decisions sometimes took months to trickle upward. You can almost hear an impatient official muttering, "By the time this reaches the emperor, my grandson will be retired." Your path leads through a side hall, where junior clerks hunch over desks. They grind ink sticks slowly on stone slabs, the rhythm steady, hypnotic, almost meditative. The air smells of soot and pine resin. Occasionally a supervisor walks by, his long sleeves swishing dramatically, peering at the neatness of each character. It's the original quality control department, minus ergonomic chairs. Imagine your modern office printer jamming. Now imagine your entire job depends on hand copying a 20-page edict without smudging a single brushstroke. That's the daily tension here. You lean over one clerk's shoulder and see him pause for a long sigh before carefully brushing the final stroke of the word for tax. The brush bristles fan slightly, threatening to blot, but he pulls it off, barely. The relief on his face is something universal, the same joy as hitting send without autocorrect changing your message into nonsense. Beyond the clerks, the halls grow grander. You step into the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the emperor himself might appear. The throne sits high, framed by dragons curling in golden swirls. Today, though, no emperor, just rows of attendants rehearsing their bows, perfecting angles that would make a yoga instructor jealous. You can almost hear the unspoken rule: bow too shallow and it's disrespectful, bow too deep and you look ridiculous. One odd ritual catches your eye. Some officials carry their petitions in silk pouches embroidered with personal motifs: clouds, cranes, waves. It's the equivalent of customizing your email signature with inspirational quotes, except here it might signal family prestige or scholarly aspiration. You stifle a laugh as one particularly serious man clutches a pouch covered in turtles. Maybe he's hoping for longevity in his career, or maybe he just really likes turtles. From the far side of the courtyard, a runner scurries by with a tray of teapots, the porcelain rattling like a nervous tambourine. You realize that bureaucracy, for all its grandeur, runs on two essentials: tea and more tea. Without it, half the ministries would probably nap through the emperor's decrees. The pace of this world is oddly soothing for you. No one's rushing to meet a deadline in the modern sense. Instead, everything unfolds with ceremony, as if time itself has to pass through layers of brush and seal before moving forward. Even the act of sealing documents is a performance: red wax, heavy stamps, the thump of authority pressed into paper. You find yourself drifting along with the rhythm, lulled by the repetitive scratch of brushes, the measured footsteps, and the echo of drums faintly outside the walls. Somewhere nearby, an official clears his throat with exaggerated dignity, as though preparing to recite something world-shaking. But when he finally speaks, it's just a reminder about the allocation of firewood. Bureaucracy Ming style. By the time you step back into the sunlight of another vast courtyard, you realize hours could pass here without anything dramatic happening, and yet in the quiet repetition, there is a strange comfort. The empire keeps humming forward on ink, paper, and patience. You might not survive the humidity or the workload, but for now, as a drowsy guest, you're content to watch the scrolls pile higher.
You drift deeper into the palace, where the atmosphere shifts again. The courtyards of bustling clerks fade behind you, and now you find yourself among hushed corridors draped with latticed screens and silken curtains. The air feels heavier, not because of dust, but because of secrets. This is the domain of the eunuchs, the curious and powerful figures who stand in that liminal space between servants and shadow rulers. They move quietly, their embroidered slippers brushing stone, their long robes gliding without a wrinkle. Some carry ledgers, others keys, and a few simply stand motionless, like statues that occasionally blink.
You can tell right away, these are not men you'd want to accidentally spill tea on. The role of eunuchs in Ming politics is one of history's enduring puzzles. Mainstream fact first. Eunuchs served as personal attendants to the emperor and his household, managing access to the inner court. They weren't just minor servants. At their height, they wielded power over finances, military logistics, and even foreign diplomacy. Some became so influential that they rivaled the authority of top ministers. You picture yourself trailing one now. He carries a stack of scrolls bound in crimson ribbon. Each step is measured, as though he knows someone's always watching. You half expect him to turn around and say, "Why are you following me?" But instead he just slides through another carved doorway, disappearing into the web of chambers. Here's the quirky tidbit. Eunuchs often developed secret codes and signals among themselves. Some historians suggest they had hand gestures or subtle ways of passing information, like a raised eyebrow or a folded sleeve. You pause by a corner and swear you just saw two of them exchange the kind of look that says, "Meet me by the incense burner. I've got news." You lean in, pretending to study the wall painting of a dragon, while your ears perk up at the faintest whispers. Historians still argue whether the eunuchs truly protected the emperor's interests, or whether they manipulated him for their own gain. To you, walking these hallways, it feels like both could be true at once. They are guardians, yes, but also gatekeepers, filtering who gets close to the throne. It's the original version of who's in the group chat and who's left out. The deeper you wander, the stranger the details. Rooms are lined with cabinets filled with ledgers, grain inventories, silk rolls, tax receipts, even lists of palace lanterns. Somewhere in that mess, eunuchs kept a running account of how many chickens were consumed in a month. You peek over one ledger, pages upon pages of chickens, tallied neatly. It's bureaucracy blended with poultry obsession. And yet the eunuchs weren't just clerks. They often became patrons of the arts, collectors of curiosities, even explorers of strange technologies. Some kept private gardens where they raised rare plants, or sponsored theatrical troupes to perform behind closed walls. Imagine binge-watching your favorite show, but instead of Netflix, it's a traveling opera company you personally bankroll. One eunuch glides past carrying a tray of tiny porcelain cups, steam curling upward. You can almost smell the earthy tea leaves. Another adjusts a lantern, tilting it just enough to cast a softer glow on the mural of cranes overhead. Their world is one of details, every curtain folded precisely, every mat aligned to perfection. It makes you oddly self-conscious about your own socks back home, probably mismatched again. The palace corridors are a labyrinth, and you soon realize that's the point. They're designed so never outsiders know where they truly are. You catch faint echoes of music, plucked strings and low flutes, but when you follow, the sound vanishes, replaced by murmured conversations and the rustle of robes. There's a tale you overhear, whispered by two attendants. They speak of a eunuch who once rose so high that he commanded fleets, issuing orders to generals. Some believe these powerful figures steered the empire's destiny more than emperors themselves. Others dismiss it as rumor inflated over centuries. Either way, you can feel the weight of their presence, like shadows clinging to the edges of every carved pillar. You pause at a doorway framed with dragons, peering into a chamber filled with scroll racks. A young eunuch carefully unrolls a decree, his lips moving silently as he rehearses its contents. The brushwork glistens with red ink, the emperor's seal stamped at the bottom like a fiery sun. The eunuch rolls it back up, tucks it under his arm, and vanishes into the night's shadows. For you, a drowsy traveler, it's almost lulling. The constant shuffling of slippers, the faint echoes of whispers, the occasional clink of porcelain, everything blurs into a rhythm. You could fall asleep right here against a cold stone column, dreaming of embroidered robes and sealed scrolls. But the corridor pulls you onward, as though it promises there's always another secret around the next bend. And somewhere, in the distance, beyond even the eunuch's reach, lies the throne itself. But before you get there, You'll need to pass through yet more layers of scholars, rituals, and endless ink.
You shuffle onward, and the quiet whispers of the eunuchs give way to a different sound entirely. The scratch of brushes, the murmur of debate, and the occasional sharp sniff of disapproval. You've wandered into the domain of the scholar officials, those Confucian-trained men who run the empire with one hand on their teacups and the other on their scrolls. The room is lined with low tables scattered with brushes, inkstones, and folded robes. Scholars sit cross-legged or kneel stiffly, their long sleeves pooling like puddles on the floor. You perch nearby, half invisible, watching as they argue in the most polite way possible. Imagine the tone of two modern academics quibbling over footnotes, except now it's about whether a ritual bow should be at a 30-degree angle or 35. A mainstream fact to ground you. Scholar officials in the Ming Dynasty were products of the imperial examination system. They had clawed their way through endless hours of memorizing Confucian classics, passing one grueling exam after another, until finally, miraculously, they could sit here debating the allocation of rice tax. These are the men who kept the bureaucratic machine oiled, though perhaps not always efficiently. One scholar clears his throat and quotes a Confucian line about benevolence, which sounds noble enough, though you notice his neighbor rolling his eyes discreetly. Another fiddles with a brush, twirling it between his fingers like a fidget spinner. They all pretend to listen intently, but you get the sense some are daydreaming about dinner. It's reassuring. Bureaucratic meetings haven't changed much in 600 years. Here's the quirky tidbit. Officials often sprinkled powdered tea into their ink water to keep their brushes supple and fragrant. You picture your average office worker today accidentally dunking a tea bag into the printer, and somehow it feels just as absurd. You lean closer, and yes, that faint aroma of tea lingers in the ink strokes as the characters dry glossy and neat. Historians still argue whether the Confucian scholar class genuinely guided imperial policy or simply repeated well-worn doctrines while the eunuchs pulled the real strings. As you watch them nod and mumble, "Indeed," in practiced tones, you suspect the truth lies somewhere between noble ideals and sheer survival. After all, it's safer to praise benevolence in theory than to risk offending someone with real power. The debate continues. One man insists the rice shipments should be redirected to famine-stricken provinces, while another worries about angering tax-paying landlords. Their voices rise slightly, but only in the way that a breeze raises leaves, never too loud, never too brash. You imagine them in a heated argument, but the heat is tepid at best, like lukewarm soup. The tea, though, that's where the real passion lies. Silver pots circulate among the scholars, porcelain cups clink gently, and steam curls lazily. Each sip is followed by a moment of contemplation, as though enlightenment might emerge with the right brew. A few men even tap their fingers lightly on the table, an ancient gesture of thanks to the tea pourer. You can't help but smile. It's basically the polite version of a thumbs-up emoji. The air here feels both serious and soporific. You imagine nodding off while one official drones about the moral decay of farmers who failed to bow properly during harvest festivals. The scholar next to you quietly adjusts his hat, pulling it down just enough to hide the fact that his eyelids are drooping. Somewhere in the back, a young assistant busily copies down every word, his brush racing to keep up. Poor guy. He'll spend hours tonight reviewing smudged notes about how many strings of cash equal a sack of grain. His cramped fingers twitch slightly, as though begging for mercy. You almost want to hand him an ergonomic keyboard. Outside the chamber, faint sunlight filters through lattice windows, striping the floor with golden rectangles. Dust motes float lazily, adding an unintentional air of philosophy to the scene. You half expect someone to wax poetic about the dust of the ages settling upon the scrolls. Instead, one scholar sneezes loudly, startling everyone. The rhythm of this world is hypnotic. Brushstrokes, murmurs, sips of tea, sighs of resignation. It's the kind of atmosphere where decisions are technically made, but time seems to stand still. You feel yourself swaying, caught between the scent of tea ink and the gentle drone of Confucian aphorisms. Then, just as you think nothing will change, a scholar at the far end stands abruptly. He bows to the group, declares his disagreement in formal, flowery language, and storms out. Well, storms in the scholarly sense, meaning he walks slightly faster than usual. The others watch, eyebrows raised, then calmly resume their tea. Drama, Ming style. And as you drift toward the doorway, you realize this scene could repeat itself endlessly. Scholars debating, tea brewing, brushes scratching. It's not glamorous, but it's the steady heartbeat of the dynasty. And though you probably wouldn't survive memorizing all those Confucian texts, tonight you're just a drowsy observer, lulled by ink and steam.
You step out from the echo of scholarly voices and drift toward the warehouses where trade goods are stacked like puzzle pieces. The scent hits first: silk that smells faintly of dye vats, porcelain that still carries the ghost of kiln smoke, spices that sneak into your nose with a tickle. You're in the middle of the Ming Dynasty's bustling trade machine, where objects speak as loudly as people. Row after row of bolts of silk shimmer in the dim light. They ripple like liquid when touched, their colors ranging from deep indigo to blinding scarlet. Imagine a rainbow, but organized and bundled by accountants with clipboards. You drag your fingers across one bolt and think, soft enough to make a pillow, but expensive enough that you'd never actually sleep on it. A mainstream fact to ground you. Ming China's silk was among the most prized exports on the global market. Through land caravans and sea routes, it found its way to Persia, Africa, and even Europe. The empire practically dressed half the world without leaving its borders. When you picture Renaissance nobles wrapped in shimmering brocades, chances are the threads were woven right here in these storerooms. Porcelain, too, sits stacked in crates, blue and white patterns curling across bowls and vases like tiny storms frozen mid-swish. You hold one carefully, too carefully, since you know if you dropped it, your entire Ming adventure would end in instant bankruptcy. A warehouse worker shrugs casually while handling 3 at once. To him, these are dinnerware. To you, they're museum pieces with "do not touch" signs. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some porcelain vases were so large they could hold a small child, or a very lazy puppy. They weren't just decorative, they sometimes doubled as storage containers. You can almost picture one being used as a Ming-era laundry basket, though no official record would admit such indignity. Historians still argue whether Ming trade policies were open door or locked gate. On one hand, the dynasty allowed foreign merchants into designated coastal cities and oversaw vast maritime expeditions. On the other, it often restricted private trade and controlled exports tightly. To you, wandering among silk and porcelain, the answer feels like both, abundance and control in one breath. You move closer to a group of workers carefully wrapping porcelain in straw mats, their fingers quick, their rhythm practiced. Each bundle is loaded onto wooden carts bound for distant markets. The squeak of cartwheels mixes with the rustle of silk and the faint clink of pottery. It's a soundscape as steady as rainfall, oddly soothing if you let yourself listen. Then a scene that makes you smile. 2 merchants squabble over a shipment of silk. Their argument escalates until one dramatically flaps a bolt of fabric at the other, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Neither wins, but the dust settles on both their hats, leaving them equally ridiculous. Bureaucracy belongs to scholars, but comedy belongs to warehouses. Nearby, spices and tea leaves wait in tightly sealed baskets. Open one and you're overwhelmed. Pepper sharp enough to sting your nose, cinnamon curling sweetly, tea smelling earthy and green. A dock worker sneezes, the sound echoing like a cannon, startling a row of chickens being herded past.
That's right, livestock wander here too, because apparently commerce has no zoning laws. You lean against a crate and imagine the journey ahead. Camels trudging west with silk strapped to their humps, junks sailing south with porcelain swaying in their holds. The goods you see now will become the luxuries of another continent months from now. The global web of trade stretches outward, and you're standing at its beating heart. In the corner, a group of artisans paint porcelain with steady hands. Their brushes are finer than needles, each stroke as delicate as a spider's thread. One artist sneaks a glance at you, then chuckles softly when your eyes widen at his speed. To him, it's just another day. To you, it feels like watching magic. As you wander on, the light grows dimmer, filtering through small, high windows. Dust motes float in golden beams, settling on silk, porcelain, and spice alike. The workers keep moving, their rhythm undisturbed, their patience endless. You realize this is the unglamorous engine of empire, not thrones or temples, but warehouses filled with fabrics, bowls, and spices, quietly making their way to the world. And with each step, you feel heavier, lulled by the creak of carts and the whisper of silk. The Ming capital may roar with voices outside, but here it hums with objects, each one carrying a story across oceans. You drift along, just another shadow between crates, almost forgetting you're not supposed to touch that vase.
The warehouses fade behind you, and now you find yourself outside a sprawling examination compound. It looks less like a school and more like a prison. Row after row of narrow cubicles, each just big enough for one person to sit, write, and slowly lose their sanity. The imperial examination is underway, and you're about to step into the minds of 1,000 anxious scholars. The compound buzzes with nervous energy. Men shuffle in with baskets of bedding, food, and ink, each looking like they've aged 5 years in the walk from the gate to their assigned booth. Guards check supplies to make sure no one sneaks in cheat sheets. You imagine trying to slip in a modern study guide and immediately getting caught. Because, let's face it, a glowing paperback would look suspicious here. A mainstream fact. The Ming Dynasty civil service exams were notoriously grueling, often lasting several days. Candidates were locked into tiny cubicles where they had to compose essays on Confucian classics, demonstrate poetic skill, and solve policy questions. Success meant a career as an official. Failure meant going home with nothing but cramped fingers and bruised pride. You peer into a cubicle. The scholar inside sits on a wooden plank no wider than a park bench. His bedding is rolled up in the corner, his inkstone balanced precariously beside a jar of water. He dips his brush, sighs deeply, and begins scratching out lines of text, pausing every so often to mutter passages he memorized as a child. You feel a pang of sympathy. He's not just writing, he's gambling his entire future on brushstrokes. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some candidates grew so desperate that they wrote their essays in minuscule characters on their robes or even tattooed answers on their skin. One story claims a scholar inked formulas onto his fam, pretending it was decoration. Of course, if he was caught, it was game over. You glance at a nearby cubicle and swear you see someone glancing a little too often at his sleeve. Historians still argue whether these exams created a true meritocracy or simply rewarded those wealthy enough to study for years without farming or laboring. As you drift along the rows, the mix is clear. Some scholars wear threadbare robes, others gleam in finer cloth. Everyone sweats the same, though, under the relentless pressure. The air smells of ink, sweat, and faintly sour rations. Candidates gnaw on dried buns, sip lukewarm water, and occasionally groan quietly. A guard walks past, stone-faced, making sure no one sneaks in cheat sheets. You imagine trying to slip in a modern study guide and immediately getting caught because, let's face it, a glowing paperback would look suspicious here. One scholar leans his head against the wall, eyes half closed, muttering lines of Confucius. You imagine him drifting off mid-essay, brush still in hand,
only to wake with a blot of ink across his sleeve. Another taps his brush against the inkstone nervously, creating a steady, maddening beat. It's a symphony of anxiety, and you're seated in the front row. The ordeal drags on for days. Each candidate is allowed only short breaks for meals or brief rest, all within their cubicle. You glance at the bedding rolled in the corner and try to imagine curling up in such a space. You'd last maybe 20 minutes before pleading for Netflix and a pillow. Outside, families gather at the gates waiting for news. Mothers whisper prayers, fathers pace, siblings bring extra food parcels. For them, one scholar's success could raise the whole family status. Failure, however, is just as communal, disappointment rippling outwards like a stone in a pond. Inside again, you notice one scholar carefully rolling his essay into neat sections, his brushwork precise, his posture calm. He looks like he's been preparing his whole life for this moment. Another, 2 rows down, looks ready to burst into tears over a question about agricultural policy. You quietly cheer for them both, knowing that history will only remember the names of a few who pass. By nightfall, lanterns flicker across the compound, casting yellow light onto pale, strained faces. The scholars write on, determined, exhausted, half-dreaming. The sound of brushes never truly stops. It rises and falls like waves, lulling you into a drowsy rhythm. And as you step back from the rows of cubicles, you can't help but marvel. This is the furnace where officials are forged, the crucible of ink and sweat that sustains an empire. You, though, are only a visitor, and you're already ready for a nap.